You're listening to episode 261 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Rick Repetti joins us to speak about Buddhist perspectives on free will. Buddhism's love affair with the self is quite dynamic. Some schools and Buddhists are adamant about no self. Others understand that an ideological list of things self, capital S, is not, doesn't mean there isn't a conventional self, lowercase s. And there are implications about that sometimes aversive relationship with the self, like what it means for the question of free will. Rick Repetti received a PhD at the CUNY Graduate Center in 2005 on the problem of free will. He is taught at Brooklyn College, LaGuardia Community College, and Vassar College, and is professor of philosophy at Kingsborough Community College, where he teaches Asian philosophy, philosophy of religion, ancient philosophy, and global ethics, and leads a weekly meditation group for the college community. He is the author of The Counterfactual Theory of Free Will, a genuinely deterministic form of soft determinism, and several articles on Buddhism, meditation, and free will. He is a yoga and meditation practitioner since 1973, an instructor in both since 2000. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice maple nut tea. Our guest today is Rick Repetti. Rick, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ted. Great to be here.
So glad to be speaking with you in person because we've been speaking online for quite some time, and it's just a great honor to have you on the podcast talking about this very nuanced concept that we'll be talking about today. But before we go into that, let's have you start us off by telling us about your background.
Well, the feeling is mutual. I'm honored to be here, and it's great to have finally met you kind of digitally in a new way rather than just through print. Okay, so let's see. Background is a big, broad question. So there's my formal academic background, but then there's kind of what led to that. So let me start with what led to that because I think it's relevant, and you'll see why. When I was about 15 years old, I was actually flicking through channels on the television, and I saw two beautiful women in leotards in sensual poses, what turned out to be a yoga class. And I followed along, and it was an Asian-looking man whose name happened to be an Anglican-type name, Richard Hittleman. The show was Richard Hittleman's Yoga for Health or something like that. At the end, we had a deep relaxation, meditation kind of experience, and I had a kind of out-of-body experience. It was mind-blowing, and it sparked my journey into things like meditation and yoga and philosophy. So what was kind of mind-blowing about it was, I had no reference for that. I had never really read anything about anything like that. So I went out and went to the library and started looking up yoga and meditation and wound up reading all sorts of weird stuff that I barely understood. And eventually I wound up majoring in philosophy in college because of those interests. But I went to City University of New York as an undergraduate and also right through to my PhD program in philosophy. But there were no classes available to me at the undergraduate or the graduate level in Buddhism or Asian philosophy or anything like that. Philosophy departments at the time in CUNY were mostly, and probably significantly still are, analytic Western philosophy, traditional, not even continental philosophy. European philosophy was kind of low on the totem pole in those programs. But when it came time to writing my dissertation, I had majored, focused on, or rather specialized in philosophy of language, logic, and science, which was all the rage at the CUNY Graduate Center at the time. And so just kind of to prove my mettle, in the program, I focused on all that stuff and I did quite well. But when it came to writing my dissertation, I just couldn't bring myself to writing on something like that. That didn't really capture my interest. What still captured my interest was the issue of free will. And I had, I should say, since that first meditation experience, many other mystical, what I call mystical or paranormal or kind of paradigm-shattering experiences that led me to seriously question my ordinary understanding of reality. I had precognitive experiences also that I just couldn't make sense of, given the idea that, well, so many different human beings have free will. And how could I know what was going to happen in the future if so many free decisions were a part of it? I mean, now that I've had tremendous training in analytic philosophy, which is very skeptical, I question my own experiences and the validity of them. But that's really pretty much what drove me and my interest in free will, just trying to understand do we have free will? That kind of thing. So when it came time to writing my dissertation, I decided to write it on free will. And at the same time, because of the way that graduate programs in philosophy are, there's a kind of dominant ideology and a worldview, and there are kind of ways of thinking and writing and doing research that are like sort of not considered, reputable or central, but are more like fringe. So I kind of wound up, my intuitions informed my dissertation on free will. But most of them were Buddhism or meditation inspired, significantly buried in footnotes. But they did inform my dissertation on free will. Once I got my PhD and got a tenure-line job at Kingsborough Community College, which is a part of the City University of New York also, so I've been a kind of CUNY person most of my life. I was fortunate to be in a department at Kingsborough Community College, which is mixed with two other departments, philosophy, history, and political science. And the way that the requirements, it's kind of a teaching-oriented institution, so they really don't care what you publish on. As long as you publish, that's great. So I was fortunate to be in a department where I could really pursue my interests outside of the kind of specialization that I had credentials for, which was Western analytic philosophy, particularly focused on philosophy of language and mind and science, and also on free will and metaphysics, but to start delving into Buddhism and Asian philosophy and teaching courses on that. And so that's what I started doing, and really trying to develop what I thought were reasonable ways of trying to understand free will in light of meditation and Indian philosophy in general and Buddhism in particular. And so that's what I've been mostly focusing on. I've done some work in other stuff. I'm a multiple decades meditation practitioner, so I've written on meditation as well. I lead a weekly meditation group on campus for faculty, staff, and students. I'm also part of CUNY. It's a big university that has about 20-odd different campuses. And so I lead a CUNY-wide group of over 100 contemplative academics. We've had a few conferences and lecture series and things like that. And that's pretty much, I think, the most relevant stuff. I've been teaching yoga since the year, and meditation on and off campus since the year 2000. And I'm a fourth degree black belt, a little bit of personal.
What style?
Japanese karate, the style is called Shotokan.
That's my old style.
So, yeah, and since you know about it, my teacher was a pre-JKA, Japan Karate Association, sensei. And so in that style, there was only 5 degrees. And I was about to take my 5th degree black belt test when my sensei retired. And so I was frustrated that I didn't get to go to the top. But
so not someone in Nishiyama-san's lineage then?
I forget the name of his teacher. His teacher was one of Funakoshi's students. I have it written down somewhere, but it's been a while.
Thanks for letting me geek out on Kichin Funakoshi. Thank you. There are a handful of martial arts folks who are listening right now going, oh, yeah, there's that. So there's so much in that. I want to unpack some of that background a little bit. First, a great joy for you and a bit of envy that you found meditative practice to be something impactful to you in your life at such a young age, at 15. What a wonderful opportunity for you. I'm so glad that continued, that came to fruition. I'm curious if you were able to continue meditating early on, or did it take a while for you to come back to it and maybe find a group? How did that progress?
Well, right away, like I said, I went out and got my hands on books about meditation and yoga, and I started teaching myself and practicing. I had a hard time figuring out really how to control my mind with my eyes closed. And in the very beginning, I remember reading pretty much in many different places how one-pointedness was really an essential skill. And one way to do it, if you had difficulty with eyes closed, was to do it with eyes open and focus on something like a candle flame. So I did this candle gazing thing for months, and I became quite good at it, and I felt very, very strong sense of one-pointedness developing in me. And then I switched over and tried more subtle techniques with my eyes closed. And within less than a year, all my friends were hearing about meditation all the time. And I like I said, I was reading everything I could about it. I was carrying around a book by Ram Dass called Be Here Now. I suppose you're familiar with that. And treating it like a Bible at the time. And all my friends knew me as, the meditation guy on campus. And one of my friends told me that her friend had a meditation teacher in New York City, in the Village, in a basement of a church. And I was there the next week. This woman had allegedly lived in India for, 20-something years. Her name was Hilda Charlton. And so I started going to her meetings, and I immediately felt like this was my group of people, just an intuitive sense of belonging. And everything she said and did resonated with me, and I became kind of like drank the Kool-Aid, almost member of the cult. And within a few months, I didn't know that she was connected with Ram Dass, but one day she couldn't make it, and Ram Dass showed up to substitute teacher for her. And it turns out that Ram Dass was studying with her and another woman at the time named Joya, who Joya was kind of a newbie, but somebody who started having all these phenomenal meditative, mystical experiences, connected with Ram Dass's guru and with Hilda's guru. That was the first teacher, Hilda Charlton. And so the three of them, they were kind of like a trinity of gurus for me at the time. And like I said, I was only about 16. But I stayed with that group for a few years until they themselves parted ways. Ram Dass wrote about that in his book called Grist for the Mill, that he thought that they weren't as enlightened as they initially seemed, and he parted ways with them, and all the three of them split up, and we're all pointing the finger at each other. And being a teenager who had really felt tremendously transformed by my trust and faith in the three of them, it was really devastating, the impact that their breakup, that their split up had on me. And I kept going to see each of them whenever I could. Ram Dass stopped teaching for quite a while after that happened and went into service. But he would give a lecture every now and then, and I would always go and attend that. Hilda and Joya kept having meetings. I kept going to both of them. And eventually Joya moved to Florida and opened up an ashram down there on a big piece of property, and I stopped seeing her for many, many years. I didn't see her until maybe 17 years later. And I kept going to Hilda's periodically, but Hilda did not like the fact that I was going to Joya's, and eventually I kind of pulled back from being a regular at her meetings. I had a series, once I had no meditation teachers that were kind of around me, guiding me on a regular basis, I had a series of weird mystical experiences that kind of freaked me out. And at the time, I felt like I was extremely psychically sensitive. I was having like precognitive dreams all the time and out-of-body experiences and things like that. And so I decided, I remember reading, I forget who the teacher was, somebody like one of those Theravada Westerners like Joseph Goldstein or something. I just don't remember who it was, and I can't seem to find the passage. But I remember reading a lot of books about Buddhism at the time, and one of the teachers, there was a student having an interview with the teacher, and the student was complaining that his meditation practice had gotten dry and he wasn't having any experiences anymore, but he was like, bragging a lot about his experiences and how great they were and how special he felt and everything. And I forget the exact way the conversation unfolded, but the teacher said something to the student like, well, where are all of your experiences now? And I remember when I read that, just thinking, wow, that's kind of like me. I thought I was in this great place because I was having all these phenomenal things happen to me, but really they weren't really helping me at the moment, because I was feeling kind of spiritually and existentially like displaced and lost and ungrounded. And no matter what I would read at the time, the Buddhist stuff really resonated with me. And those three teachers, by the way, they were more in the Hindu tradition, although they certainly promulgated various things about Buddhism, and Ram Dass taught mindfulness and things like that. Their overall, I suppose, tradition or lineage was Hindu-oriented. But when I was kind of on my own, I became distrustful after that of the whole Hindu tradition, and everything I read about Buddhism seemed to really resonate with me. And that was in my late teens. And since then, I decided that no more teachers for me. I'm just going to practice mindfulness and one-pointedness, basic Buddhist meditation, and that's safe, and it's sterilized, and it's guru-free, and I don't have to worry about any kind of drama of getting, involved with groups that might, not really serve me well in the end, which is how I felt about those three. But I've been practicing ever since. My practice has gone up and down over the years. There have been years where no matter how tired I was, working 2 jobs, going to graduate school full time, I was so disciplined. I always knew that meditation was the one thing in my life that was really required and essential and grounding. And so I would keep my practice even when all it consisted of was me nodding out and then waking up, and nodding out and waking up, and nodding out and waking up. But then there have been years where I think my practice had been so good that I felt like my mindful awareness was kind of running on, I guess, the seam of my meditation practice. And my actual discipline of sitting formally went down. And so it's gone up and down and up and down. Lately it's more up than down, which is a good thing. But it's been the most important thing, I think, in my life, meditation practice. And that's really, more than, like I said, I didn't learn hardly anything about Buddhism academically. Anything I learned academically about it was on my own after I finished my dissertation pretty much and started getting exposed to Buddhist scholarship. But my intuitions about free will and Buddhism, they're from the meditation cushion and that aspect of my life more than from scholarship.
Well, let's take that as the segue to our topic of free will. Let's define that a little bit. What are the parameters of free will? What do we mean by that for today's conversation?
Yeah, I think it's problematic even to try to do that. In I think the first chapter of my dissertation, I spent the whole chapter just problematizing the idea of free will, because many of us have different ideas about what that means. If you are doing something on kind of autopilot when you're driving and having a conversation and you don't remember really how you got from point A to point B, but your driving was still voluntary. You kind of feel responsible for it. Even if you were distracted and you got into a little accident, you feel responsible for what you did. So there's a sense of like almost any kind of voluntary or intentional behavior might involve free will. Whether or not it does, that's of course one of the big problems. But so there's that, and then there's the more pointed situation where you have competing desires and you are in a state of deliberation and you're torn, whether it's a moral conflict or even just a conflict with a dinner menu, choice A or choice B. That might be, many people consider that more paradigmatic of free will, where you're weighing competing desires and expectations based on them, probable outcomes, and maybe perhaps the impact or the consequences of those, how they not only will affect others, but what kind of person that might make you. This is kind of like a highly reflective, deliberative kind of sense where we think we have free will. Whether or not we do, that's the question. I remember some studies that are relatively recent, but I'm really not so great at. I'm the kind of person when it comes to anything like that, I have to look things up, remember who's the author of that study, but I mean, I do have the stuff in my books. Children, I think, ages maybe up to around 4 and 5, and this is another thing with the numbers, I could be off by a year, but kids up to about ages 4 or 5 tend to think of free will as being able to do whatever you want to do.
Right. Free reign, not free will, free reign.
Yeah, and then a year or two older, like 6 or 7, I believe, they think free will has to do with being able to not do what you want, being able to not act on your own desires, interestingly enough. So, there's so many different ideas about what might be free will. One of the strongest intuitions that all of us have, that a fellow named Christopher Gowans at Fordham, he's written a lot on Buddhism and Buddhist ethics and everything. He made it clear to me in comments to one of my talks at the Columbia Society for Comparative Philosophy. He had commented on my paper there. He said, the bottom line for him about what free will is the sense that what we do is up to us. The idea that we're in control of what we do is up to us. I make a difference in the world in terms of what happens in me and through me and as a consequence of my choices and actions, that it's up to me in some sense. And then what's problematic about that, particularly from a Buddhist point of view, is theoretically at least, from the enlightened perspective, there's no real self or agent in Buddhism. So if there is no real self, and this is something that's very similar in Buddhist thinking and in Western scientific thinking, if almost everything that happens is dependent on causes and conditions, either prior or concurrent with some event or phenomenon, then it seems to be that those conditions are what, or those causes are what account for what occurs. And the sense that something is up to one is probably illusory. So it's really problematic just saying what free will is. There's a strong sense and a weak sense. Most philosophers and most human beings, I think, prior to philosophical reflection or taking a philosophy class or being presented with the problem of free will, tend to think of free will in the sense of the idea that something is up to me, and we call that sense strong free will. Some philosophers have a more pointed version of it called libertarianism, of course, liberty, freedom. And one of the things that's typically associated with libertarian view is that the agent, the person, is the cause. And the agent's reasons for actions are what explain the action. And those reasons are not themselves caused. So the agent in that strong Western libertarian sense is something like an unmoved mover, like a little god, or an uncaused cause. I am the cause. Based on my reasons and reflections, I choose freely Nothing causes me to choose. I am the agent. I'm the cause. I'm the ultimate source, the originating, center of my actions and choices. And one of the things associated with that is the idea that under identical conditions, suppose I chose X, whatever X is, the fried chicken or something like that, or going to CUNY as opposed to some Rutgers or something like that for a more thoughtful decision. It doesn't matter whether it's something minor or major. If I chose X, under identical conditions, I could have chosen not X, which could be Y or Z, or just not doing anything at all. And so we call that the ability to do otherwise. I could have done otherwise. This is what libertarians and many people who don't believe in free will have the same criterion. This is that kind of strong sense of free will. I did what I did, but I could have done otherwise than what I did. I wasn't caused to do what I did. I was free to do it. I could have not done it. So if we rewound the world somehow, like maybe if God could rewind the universe, so if you could go backward in time and then just release the world to go forward again, like rewinding a DVD to an earlier moment, and then you press play again, if we were in a deterministic world, a world in which everything is caused lawfully by previous conditions and the laws of nature, then I would have made the exact same choice, X, over and over again in a deterministic world.
It wouldn't have actually been a choice in that scenario. It would have been just the conditions flowing the way they flow.
Right, and that's what hard determinists say. And so there's hard and soft determinists. So it's a hard fact or a hard consequence of determinism on that view that it's really the causes and conditions that generate that. And, if you rewind the clock to prior to your existence, whether it's the Big Bang or just 6 billion years ago or whatever, or even 6 years before you were born, same outcome would occur under the same conditions if determinism is true, in which case you are not the author of what you do. The causes and conditions are, they predate you. So your choice is a mere consequence of those causes and conditions and laws of nature. And that's called the consequence argument, made famous by a fellow named Peter Van Inwagen. So I'm not sure. Buddhist scholars tend to disagree about whether or not the Buddhist theory of causation is deterministic. Some of them think that it is. For instance, Charles Friedman thinks that the Buddhist theory of causation, dependent origination or interdependent origination or whatever, is very much deterministic, and others think that it's not, that it's more later Buddhists say determinism and indeterminism is a kind of false dichotomy that's kind of only makes sense from a dualistic perspective, which is erroneous. And so just having even categories like determinist versus indeterminist makes no sense. Then there are some Buddhists who think that causation is more wiggly or indeterministic or somewhere in between. They try to have a middle path, that it's mostly deterministic but not hard deterministic. And so this is the question about there is no singular Buddhism, so there's no singular Buddhist view about causation. So there's no singular Buddhist question about whether or not free will is consistent with causation, construed however it is, according to that particular kind of Buddhism. But the bigger problem is the one that concerns the self, which I mentioned earlier. I think, not all, but almost all forms of Buddhism reject the reality of the self, except for a long extinct brand, personalists, they're called. We believe in the Pudgala, the person, Pudgalavadins, follower of the person doctrine. They believe that intermediate between the non-self at the fully enlightened level and the conventional self at the everyday level, which is kind of fully illusory, there is some kind of reality intermediate. There is an agency. And it's almost, I don't want to find myself occupying a kind of view that nobody adheres to anymore in Buddhism, but I think that they might be onto something, but I don't know enough about them because there's not that much literature on them. But I think that my position might be somewhat similar to theirs. But just getting back to like the contours of the free will problem, make it clear as day. If I was free to do X or not do X, then the world can't be deterministic. And that's what libertarians say. And well, a lot of incompatibilists are both hard determinists. There's a lot of terminology here, but incompatibilists believe you can't both be in a deterministic world and be free to do otherwise. So they agree on that. So it depends which one of those two things you think is true. If you think that we are in a deterministic world and you think determinism is incompatible with being able to do otherwise, then you're a hard determinist. You think determinism implies that there's no free will. On the other hand, if you believe we have free will and that free will is incompatible with determinism, you will conclude or infer that determinism must be false. And that's what libertarians do. And so some of them try to give a model according to which quantum indeterminacy somehow or another bubbles up in our neurons and might even be generated by our torn decision mental states. Robert Kane is the most famous person advocating that view. One of the biggest problems with trying to embrace indeterminism as a way out of the hard determinism or consequence argument problem is the following. If your choices are the result of a random process in your brain, then you're not really up to you. You can't really claim to be the author of something that randomly happens on the neuronal level. And your neurons is kind of equivalent to some kind of a seizure or a coin toss in your neurons. That might as well be a coin toss in your liver or outside of your body. It's not something that you can control. And if free will, in this stronger sense, is it being up to you what choices you make and what actions you perform, then if indeterminism is true, they're not up to you. So when you combine, well, this is the view that indeterminism is incompatible with free will, and we call that hard indeterminism. So both hard determinism and hard indeterminism, both sides agree, whether determinism or indeterminism, they're both incompatible with free will. When you combine those two views, we call that hard incompatibilism. And a fellow named Dirk Pereboom is the primary author of that. But even Galen Strawson has advocated a view very similar to that, which is one that I find very relevant to Buddhism. And he calls his argument the impossibility argument, and it goes something like this. Whenever we make a choice, we're in some state of mind. And our mental state influences or conditions our choice. And that's intuitively true. And it's not only intuitively true, but it seems to be axiomatic from a Buddhist point of view. And the emphasis in Buddhism is on paying attention to what state of mind you're in when you're choosing, thinking, acting, willing, and so on, because of this relationship, right? Mental factors are what lead to choices and actions, and we need to be mindful of them because of the consequences or the karma, depending on how you want to interpret that. So Strawson says, since you can't escape the fact that your choice is always a function of the mental state that you're in, the only way that you could truly be responsible for a choice is if you were in some kind of unconditioned mental state. But every mental state that we're in is conditioned by the previous mental state or by previous conditions. And he says, theoretically, the only way out of that is through some kind of logical impossibility of being the cause of oneself. The Latin phrase is causa sui, C-A-U-S-A. S-U-I, sui as in suicide, right? So a self-cause. He said, but it's logically impossible to be a self-cause because to cause oneself, you already have to exist to initiate that process. So it's logically impossible to be a cause of oneself. Since you can't be a cause of yourself, you can't have some initial unconditioned state that you somehow or another brought about. And so every mental state that you're ever in is conditioned. And so ultimately, and this is similar to the hard determinist argument, ultimately, you aren't really the originator, of your choices. They're not purely attributable to you. You are not the ultimate originator of them. You're not ultimately responsible for who you are, or what state of mind you're in, or what you choose. That's the impossibility argument. Now, my thinking is that although that's mostly true, and particularly for the average person it is, the whole Buddhist path is kind of predicated on undermining that, or eliminating that, or reversing that. So, and nirvana enlightenment is considered somehow or another unconditioned. Although, yeah. Now, it's hard to really, this is a paradox in and of itself for Buddhist philosophers and scholars to explain how it is that the Buddhist path, which is things that you do, lead to an unconditioned state. How could anything conditioned lead to an unconditioned? There's all kinds of ways of trying to parse that and saying that it does, but it doesn't. And I'm not really an expert on that. All I'll do is just note that that's a problem. But at the same time, the core of Buddhism is the idea that you can attain mental freedom. Enlightenment is mental freedom, freedom from all those mental factors that condition us and that cause mental bondage. So if the core premise of Buddhism is correct, then Strawson's impossibility argument is wrong. Buddhism is a kind of possibility argument that contradicts Strawson's impossibility argument. Now, if you're not a Buddhist, you might say, well, that's theoretically interesting, but I don't think anybody ever can attain that state. Right? So then that's just a question of whether or not enlightenment ever happens. But now, all the studies that have been done in the last decade or so on meditators' brains and things like that, well, certainly a lot of them are exaggerated, and the interpretations of them are overly optimistic and prematurely enthusiastic and everything, but there does seem to be a number of studies that, just for the purposes of this argument, seem relevant to me. And one of them is, which I read about in a book by Kasulis years ago called Zen Persons, I think. I forget the full title, but Zen Persons was either the title or the subtitle. And I have the reference in my book. But it was a study that he notes where Zen monks were, wired up, and they were shown a series of repetitive images. And in the control group were ordinary people who are not meditation practitioners. And in the ordinary group, after a short period of seeing repetitive images, their brains stopped showing responsiveness to them. Whereas the Zen monks kept showing, like, what is this? Be here now? They were ceaselessly responsive to the present, even though it was repetitive. So that's just one study. Some other studies are, take those Tibetan Buddhist monks that the Dalai Lama sent over to that neuroscientist Richard Davidson, who wired them up. And some of them were long-term practitioners of metta, and that's the Pali term for loving kindness. Sanskrit is Maitri. Long-term practitioners of this loving kindness, and the left prefrontal cortices of their brains were larger than the average person, and that's the empathy center of the brain, and they were all lit up when they were practicing it. Similar results on long-term practitioners of one-pointedness and mindfulness, the parts of the brain that we would expect to be developed more for those activities were more developed and more lit up during the study. So what that tells me is that meditation is not all in the mind. It can affect the brain, and it may very well be the case that the central teachings of Buddhism, which is that if you pay attention to and observe and study and track and control the causal conditions that influence you, you can turn them around in such a way that they make you more enlightened, more mentally free. So that's that I think is minimally, there's not proof, but there's some evidence from the research that I think supports that line of thinking.
It's interesting to hear this, that there seems to be a hard line. It's either 100% or nothing in these, and there's not the possibility of, no, it's not perfect from the very beginning. One is very heavily influenced when one starts a meditative practice or any kind of contemplative practice, and that the changes may be very slight and they may take a long amount of time, but over time, these changes are significant and they're measurable and they're discernible, because we have, as you're saying, Rick, I think we're changing that reactivity and we're shifting it. It doesn't mean that, oh, well, we're reactive to begin with and therefore can never get out of it. It just means, well, no, it may take time, and the impact we have is small and slow.
Yeah, I gave a talk on this at that Columbia Society. Oh, no, not Columbia Society. That was another talk. There was a Columbia conference on Buddhist ethics around the year 2010 or 2011. And I gave a talk about this. And in the talk, I gave my counter to Galen Strawson's impossibility argument. And he was in the audience, and he came up to the mic afterwards, where people were lining up at the mic, and he said, "Oh, I just want you to know I agree with you." And then afterwards, I know Galen from the graduate sector. He was on my dissertation committee, along with Harry Frankfurt, who's one of the main guys in my dissertation, whose theory of free will I didn't mention yet, but we could talk about that later. But Galen has been Galen Strawson has been a long-term practitioner of Buddhist meditation, and he's one of the first Western philosophers to really write anything significant about it, back in 1986 in his book, Freedom and Belief. But Galen said to me, after all these decades of practicing meditation, I do notice that I'm less reactive than I used to be. He said, the reactions are still there, but they're not as powerful, and I have a little more elbow room in terms of control over them. And I said, yeah, me too. That's about it. That's about it. Because this stuff is really, entrenched and deep, and yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing it from the perspective of someone who's very familiar with evolution, that these are small, incremental, and essentially random changes. There might be, however we want to term free will and influence on them, change can occur. And and what, as you've been speaking, the thing going through my mind is the exit of every podcast I do. Every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. And I put that latter part in there for that important reason. Sometimes we are overwhelmed by those conditions, and it's very difficult for us to exert what I might consider a free will on choosing to do something different than what conditions are pushing me towards.
Yeah, I think that so many of these programs that are being used now, mindfulness and behavioral therapy, all sorts of therapeutic applications of mindfulness, from a pragmatic or existential or psychologically functional point of view, not a metaphysical point, like whether or not you could have done otherwise under deterministically identical conditions, but just from lived experience in daily life. I do believe that the more you practice meditation, this is a simple cause and effect kind of thing, that the more leverage you have over the kinds of impulses that normally undermine your optimal functionality. And I think that's an axiomatic feature of almost any kind of therapeutic program that involves mindfulness.
Yeah, I also want us to unpack a little bit this. In Buddhism, there is a relationship to the self when talking about agency. A critical factor of free will is, okay, whose will? There's a person who's a will, is just process. And I wonder if you could unpack that idea of self, because it's going to vary between the different Buddhist schools as well.
Yeah, this is the real problem, I think, from a Buddhist point of view, is not the tension between causation and free will, or as it is in the Western world, whether it's deterministic causation or indeterministic causation in the Western world. And then there's an earlier problem also between God's foreknowledge and God's omnipotence and free will. And those problems are almost really identical to the deterministic problem. It's just whether or not causes make it impossible for you to have done otherwise, or God's impeccable foreknowledge, which can't be contradicted, which implies that you couldn't have done otherwise. So it's almost the same thing. And same thing with fatalism. There's a bunch of Western philosophical problems, but they all kind of analogous. But the Buddhist tension between free will is not with causation so much as it is with the concept of the self. So, as I mentioned earlier, the one school of thought in Buddhism that was okay with the concept of agency, or of an agent, I should say, as kind of intermediate being in between the conventional view of a person and the ultimate view of a non-person, and that this conventional versus ultimate thing is something we have to talk about a little bit and unpack. But the only group that believed in an intermediate level where an agent could be is that group that has no followers for over 1,000 years, the Pudgalavadins, or personalists. And most modern scholars, reject their view. Buddhist scholars reject their view. Although Evan Thompson, I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Oh, yes, he's been on the podcast.
Yeah, Dreaming, Being, I forget the full title of his book. I think he approximates a personalist view and even mentions it in his book, because the analysis that he has about the functional effectiveness of agency puts him in that somewhere in the vicinity of that view. And I think mine does too, although I'm very reluctant to come out and say that I'm one of those people. I don't know enough about them, and I know that there's such a minority view, so I'm like, this is my emotions, and I'm reluctant to put myself in a camp like that. But I'm trying to resist it, and the way that I do is by saying that I believe that a case can be made for all of the abilities that we associate with agency, so that, and particularly when you look at what makes something real in Buddhism, one of the primary or most widely agreed upon criteria in the different schools of Buddhism, from the Buddha himself all the way through to the Tibetans, although maybe not so much in Zen, because they have, some Mahayana views, later Buddhist views, just like I said, they'll just set aside any kind of non-dualistic dichotomous distinctions. But apart from that, the criterion that makes something real is causality, or not being causally inert, having causal powers. So on a certain level of analysis, goes back to the Buddha himself, the interdependent or dependent origination, that there's that claim about conditionality. I'm not going to do more than just paraphrase it, because I'm really not good at remembering exact quotes, but it's something like, when this is the case, that is the case. When this is not the case, that is not the case. Remove this and you remove that. Introduce this and you introduce that, that kind of thing. That's the kind of core statement of dependent origination, but it has causality built into it. And I believe that some of the early Indian Buddhist philosophers, like arguing against the Hindu, or at the time, they didn't have the word Hindu, but Vedic philosophers, rejected the idea of the soul, or the Atman, on the grounds that it was causally inert. Right? It couldn't do anything. It was changeless and eternal, and so it was kind of non-entity. If it couldn't interact or be interacted with, it couldn't cause an effect or be affected by anything, then by definition, it ruled itself out of real existence. It couldn't exist. So there's a whole bunch of arguments that run throughout Buddhism about causality being the grounds for something having, let's say, at least conventional reality. Conventional reality. And this is the distinction between conventional and ultimate is very complicated. And maybe you'll remind me again later to try to speak to it.
No, we're not going into that mess.
Okay, but it's really important to sort things out in terms of what the Buddhist perspectives are. But like we can only go so far today.
The table is a table until you look really, really close, and then it's energy and influx. We'll leave it at that level.
Right, that's good enough. Right, and we have the same distinction in the Western world. Wilfrid Sellars made that distinction between what he called the manifest image, which is the common sense view of the world, that G.E. Moore also talked about. And he said, "Here's a hand," and he raised his hand. And then the more scientific view, which is, there are no macro level objects. There are only these quantum processes and atoms and stuff like that. So you have that in Buddhism also. My thought is that, I already started to say this, but then I went running around a little bit, but I'll get back to it, that if you take the causal ground or causal criterion for the metaphysical reality of something, even if ultimately, like from later Mahayana Buddhist perspective, everything in the universe is fundamentally metaphysically insubstantial or empty of substance and unreal, right? And then it's just a question of what things have conventional reality, right? And different schools of Buddhism disagree about that. So pretty much how a tradition or school in Buddhism parses conventional versus ultimate reality will determine what I think its views on agency will be. So like the early Abhidharma, Theravadan, Buddhist views about ultimate reality is that atoms and things like that are real, and that they have metaphysical substance, even if it's momentary. They are like psychophysical tropes, a kind of atomistic mind moments or whatever. Dhammas, kalapas, whatever, right? So it depends on where the reference is. So, we can't resolve that issue today. I'm not even sure I can say much more than what
I thought we were going to solve this one.
Oh. Yeah. I mean, I can't even say much intelligent. I don't think so about it. It's a really vexing problem. But my thinking about it is that if you apply that kind of conditional formula, that when this is present, that is present, when this is absent, that is absent, and so on, that kind of thinking to human actions and choices and volitions and deliberation and thinking, and you really analyze what goes on in voluntary human behavior, you can conclude that agency is a real thing, that agency is a kind of closely clustered set of causally effective abilities that individuals possess, and that they're close enough to what we mean by free will, independent of what the causal nature of reality is, like whether or not it's deterministic or indeterministic. So I think that free will, at least in a conventional sense, if understood to be those abilities, I think that you can argue that it's real enough on the conventional level, and that there's enough of it to ground moral responsibility. And of course, this varies from person to person, especially from a Buddhist point of view. 99% of human beings are so heavily conditioned and influenced by ignorance and greed and hatred, and the three poisons, or just attachment, aversion, and ignorance or delusion, that it's as if we're all hard determined. But the more my intuition and my experience tells me that the more that you practice being aware of all of that, the less mental bondage you have and the more mentally free you become, and the more your agency actually, as a set of abilities, increases and becomes stronger. Now, to me, somebody might want to argue, if they were not a Buddhist, that those same arguments and grounds could be used to defend the reality of a person or an agent. But obviously that goes against almost all of Buddhist philosophy, which is more of a kind of process metaphysics. So I think that Buddhist philosophy can accept agency as a kind of causally efficient set of processes if they're closely clustered in an individual person series the right way, without thereby committing themselves to a person. Also, the main argument against the reality of a thing like a person is part whole reductionism. There are no wholes in Buddhism. only parts and parts of parts, and so on, all the way down. In early Buddhism, at the bottom are atoms, and those are real. In later Buddhism, there's nothing that's real. That's the general idea of how I try to go about saying that you could have free will in Buddhism as agency, as conventional, not necessarily ultimate, without having a person as a real thing. But I'm not so sure about that last part. And I think that the same arguments that you might make for agency, somebody might try to make for person. I wouldn't want to make them because I don't want to be a Pudgalavadan or a personalist. Only because I try to avoid trouble, and I think that's trouble.
Bhagavadis, yeah. It's interesting that the discussion, the reasonings behind both really lend themselves towards at what level are we talking? If
Right.
we're living in the conventional world, because I don't, as a living, breathing, thinking, driving to work, having a bite to eat being, I don't really exist in the quantum realm. That's not where my experience is. I can't experience that. What I experience is conventional reality. I experience the table, and no matter how deeply true it may be that the table is an energy flux, it still hurts if I hit my head on it. So I'm going to go with I exist as a conventional being. And that shifts the perspective on this concept of self and free will. And Gautama didn't deny self in its entirety, just that the things that we conventionally think of as self maybe aren't that one thing. Maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that. And it's not this piece or that piece or that piece. And so as a being, I can still say, I may make errors, but I'm still going to do what I believe to be. And since I have no proof to the contrary, no evidence to the contrary, no reason to inhabit a quantum realm to the contrary, I'm going to go with, yeah, there are strong influences on me, and I can still be as aware as I can be of that and do my best to make a choice.
Yeah, I like that, and I'm glad you reminded me of the historical Buddha, because I think it's important. Two things. You also mentioned that he didn't completely reject the self, and he says he neither asserts nor denies the self in some contexts. And what he denies is that the self is identical to the aggregates or independent of them, or both, or neither. And that's a really complicated kind of logic that I've been banging my head against. Four-cornered negation,
But it's only an energy flux table, so I'm sure it didn't hurt your head at all when you're banging it.
Yeah. So there's that. So it's not clear, even though Buddhism, by and large, is taken, even by most Buddhists, to deny the reality of the self. The more correct way of stating that is much more nuanced in the way that you just suggested. So thank you for that. The other thing that the Buddha said that's important, in a number of different passages, he rejected fatalism. He rejected causation by chance, by fate, and by the gods. So, and I don't have them on my fingertips, but I have the references for those in my written works. Those are all equivalent to the Western forms of free will skepticism. Those things that he rejected. So he rejected 4 standard Western grounds for free will skepticism. To me, that makes it sound like he ridiculed those views. There aren't that many views that he ridiculed. Those are some of the views that he ridiculed, that he thought they were self-contradictory. The denial of agency.
The demonstrable denial of agency.
Well, like, how did you walk here? Did your feet walk themselves? That kind of thing. Those are the kinds of questions that he asked the fatalists and similar critiques of the other views that I just mentioned. So he seems to have endorsed some sort of conventional acceptance of agency as causally effective. And it's presupposed by the Eightfold Path. You can do these things and they will alter you in certain ways.
Yeah, if there were no ability to influence whatsoever, if it were all predetermined and
Right.
conditioned and there were no escape, then there is no point to the entire thing. And yet there it is. And there was the effort to go forward with that.
Right.
Yeah. I wonder if we might shift to more mundane topics for a little bit and just chat for a few minutes about the book itself, Buddhist Perspectives on Free Will. So you're the editor of that. You had a number of people who wrote articles for it, and some of the folks who get the book, and there will be a link to this on the episode page for the episode, will notice some very familiar names in there. And Rick, I was wondering if you just talk for a few minutes about the book itself and some of what's in there.
Sure. Let me just add that it's probably on your website, but the subtitle is Agentless Agency with a question mark after it. So yeah, is there such a thing? And that to me is my way of foregrounding the fact that the problem in Buddhism is whether or not you could have agency in the absence of an agent. So like you said, one of your strongest interests in this subject was how could you have free will if there's no self? So I guess that's a good starting point because some of the people in the book take that view. Galen Strawson, who I mentioned before, he just presupposes that it's obvious that if there's no self, there can't be free will. But his contributing chapter, chapter 6, Free Will in the Sense of Self, is a revised version of material that was originally in that book of his that I mentioned earlier, Freedom and Belief, 1986. He significantly rewrote that. It was like arguments spread across 2 chapters in that book, and he significantly revised that here. Here he makes it's a kind of thought experiment where he says, look, you Western philosophers who are hard determinists or free will skeptics, you make the argument as professional scholars that there can't be such a thing as free will. He said, but you live as if you have free will. And what he tries to do here is to get them to really assimilate their theoretical perspective pragmatically, practically, psychologically by having them go through a thought experiment in which they try to be conscious of or conjure up the awareness of the fact that every single thought, emotion, sensation, perception, and event that happens in and around them and through them is deterministic. To constantly, even just for a few minutes, reflect on the deterministic origin of everything. And he thinks that if that happens to them, they will lose their sense of self. And he says, his own father, I don't know if you're familiar with Galen Strawson's father, Peter P.F. Strawson, is a famous British philosopher who had argued in the 1960s, I forget the year, 62 or 64, an article called Freedom and Resentment, that even if determinism, if a headline came out in the news tomorrow, determinism proven true, he said it would not undermine our normative practices and what he called reactive attitudes, things like resentment and shame and all that. Those feelings, there's a whole web of normative emotions and reactive patterns and habits and interpersonal modes of being that presuppose that what we do is up to us. If you stepped on my foot and I thought you were being rude or inconsiderate, but I knew that it was deterministic, I shouldn't hold you responsible. But Peter Strawson thought, no, those norms are so ingrained in us that they're immune to the knowledge about the truth of determinism. But his son, Galen, disagrees with him. And so he's trying to disagree with Daddy. Try to prove to those philosophers who believe in determinism, but who, like his father, don't think it matters to them personally, to get them to think deeply enough about it in a way that it'll shift them. And he says, guess what? If that's not working, maybe you should practice Buddhist meditation, because here's a whole tradition and a culture of people for millennia who live accepting the reality of there not being a real self. And I don't know how true that is, because I think the average Buddhist might be something like the average Catholic or something. The average Catholic is not the same as Thomas Aquinas or Augustine or something like that. but that's what that one article is about. And I'm not going to go through this in the exact order, but the next chapter from Susan Blackmore, I don't know if you know who she is. She's written a lot about consciousness and about paranormal. So this is also a reprint of hers that she edited. Most of the articles in the book are new, but a small handful of them are reprints that I thought would really round out the book. Hers is one of them. And it's more like a phenomenological narrative where she's doing kind of something very much like what Galen Strawson suggests that people do in his thought experiment, only she claims that this is how she lives her everyday life, constantly being mindful in a way, not necessarily that things are deterministic, but in a way that they're impersonally generated. And so it's an interesting thing just to follow her through that and kind of inhabit her experience. She claims that this is the reality for her. Let's see, who else can we talk about here? Oh, yeah. So I mentioned Chris Gowans before. He has the opening chapter. He says, why the Buddha didn't discuss the problem of free will and determinism. And Chris, who I told you, he commented on a paper of mine about the idea that if we think we have free will, we think what we do is up to us, right? So that was the same guy. In this chapter, he says he thinks that the main reason, there's a question, why has Buddhism been silent? I just realized I never mentioned this, but this is really important. Ever since the Buddha, rejected fatalism and those other views, no Buddhists have really talked about free will until very recent encounters with Western philosophy and Western philosophers being interested in what Buddhism thinks and vice versa. So it's in the last 50 years or so that there's been anything explicitly said about free will. So Chris Gowans is addressing that, and he thinks the reason why Buddhism has remained relatively silent on the question of free will is because of the Buddha's what we call soteriological parameters. Soteriology is kind of like salvific or what is it called? And salvation-oriented. Soteriology is the study of things that are oriented towards salvation. So the thrust of Buddhism is soteriological. It gears towards enlightenment. And the Buddha, as you probably know, refused to answer certain metaphysical questions like whether or not there was a beginning, whether or not the Buddha exists after he dies, and things like that. And the classical story is of the Buddha making an analogy to somebody who was questioning him in such a manner. The Buddha says, imagine a fellow shot by an arrow. The primary thing is to remove the arrow. It doesn't matter who shot it, what the arrow was made of, why the guy shot it, that sort of thing. And by analogy, the Buddha said, my only teaching is the end of suffering. And so certain metaphysical questions, discussion of them do not promote the end of suffering. They don't, lead towards it. They don't help. They might only entangle bad views. And so I'm going to leave them aside. And we call that, Chris Gowans says, he calls those soteriological parameters of Buddhism. And he thinks for that reason that Buddhism has remained silent on the issue of free will. I'm not so sure I agree with him, because like I said, the Buddha himself seemed to have expounded very clearly views that are opposite of free will skepticism. I think maybe he just was so successful that the tradition never really thought that those were problems ever since then. That's one possible explanation, and there are many others. And there's another problem with his view is that there are some very complex metaphysical views in Buddhism that it doesn't strike me offhand that the average Buddhist, like the average Catholic, having access to those philosophical disputes does not seem soteriologically relevant. And yet Buddhism has generated vast theoretical frameworks about certain epistemological and metaphysical issues. So, I'm not so sure I agree with Chris on that. Let's see. Let me jump ahead. Oh, yeah, Charles Goodman. I'll skip my own because I've been talking about my own views all along, and most of them probably came up already that are somewhat in these chapters. But I wrote the introduction, I wrote two other chapters. One in the beginning, why I think there should be a Buddhist theory of free will, but I think I'm answering that in the process. And then the last chapter in the book where I give my own kind of positive recommendations. But chapter 3 is Charles Goodman. In an earlier paper, Charles argued very forcefully the very simple intuition that drove your question about the self. If there's no self in Buddhism, then there can't be an autonomous self. Simple as that. And he thinks Buddhism is deterministic, and therefore it's hard deterministic. Because if causation is deterministic, like you yourself suggested, it seems that the agent is not really doing anything. It's just a consequence of ancient causes and conditions. And moreover, if there's no self, how could there possibly be an agent that has autonomy? So that was his earlier paper, and I critiqued that paper in the journal Buddhist Ethics a few years ago, just on the grounds like similar to what I just said now, but I remember a simple analogy that I made back then, which was something like, suppose there were no red apples because there were no apples. That wouldn't mean that there was nothing that was red. So by analogy, if there's no agent, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no self-control, even though there's no real self. The ability for an individual to control itself might be real. And that's pretty much the argument that I made. But now in this, because he and I engaged in that debate, and we've discussed it, in print and also in emails and in person. Charles is a friend of mine, thank God. Because my encounter with him first was a critic. What I try to do most of the time, whenever I'm going to critique somebody, is I send them my paper before I submit it for publication, and I ask them if they would like me to change anything or if they want to apply. And it's a really good practice.
I think it's an extension of fairness and kindness to say, am I getting this right? Am I representing your view correctly?
Yeah, I think it's respectful, and it's passionate and friendly, and I've made a lot of friends that way, and it's helped me in the long run. So Charles and I have been involved in this discussion for a while, and so his chapter here is a kind of attempt to answer my earlier objections, and the way that he does it is is kind of very clever and ironic. That the title alone might give it away. Quote, uses of the illusion of agency. Why some Buddhists should believe in free will.
Well, it's an illusion. I'd start with that.
He still holds the same view that it's illusory, but he acknowledges the validity of some of my arguments that along the path, having a conception about the effectiveness of your own agency seems to be presupposed. And so, he'll give me that. That kind of thing. I'm really simplifying it, and his argument is much more sophisticated than that, but, there's only so much that I can say here. Charles is a brilliant guy, and very good-natured fellow. So Jay Garfield, chapter 4, another great title, just another word for nothing left to lose. I'm sure you know the reference from that famous song that Janus is not the originator of, by the way. I forget who the original group was that did that song, but Janis Joplin made it more famous, I think. The subtitle is Freedom, Agency, and Ethics for Madhyamikas. Jay Garfield and similarly Owen Flanagan in the next chapter after him, they both make a very strong argument to the effect that the very concept of free will has its genesis in Western theodicy. Now, theodicy, maybe not everybody listening is a philosopher of religion. Theodicy is a term that refers to a theology's answer to or attempt to answer the problem of evil. And the problem of evil, very briefly, is if God is all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful, then being all-knowing, he knows how to create a perfect world without gratuitous suffering. Being all-powerful, he's able to. And being all-loving, he wants to. So it follows from that this should be a perfect world without any gratuitous or pointless evil or suffering in it. And yet there's tremendous evil, and much of it seems pointless. So how do you reconcile those two things? it seems like it's God's will. So I think Augustine was the first Western philosopher to articulate the idea that, well, God gave us free will, as evident in the Garden of Eden story and all of that.
And then did nothing but punish us for exercising that free will.
Yeah, I know. That's another problem. There are so many problems with that. To me, it's like a rug. No matter which way you push the bump in the rug, it won't go away. So I teach philosophy of religion class, and theodicy, I think, is the most interesting philosophy of religion problem, and there's just so many different ways of going at it. Basic idea is that Augustine invented, according to J. Garfield and Owen Flanagan, he invented the idea of free will to get God off the hook. So God gave us free will, we choose, we cause evil. And some brilliant philosophers in that tradition have defended the view very intelligently, I think. Some of them, like Eleanor Stump, has said something like, if God wanted to have real beings that were not God, beings that were separate from him and from his will, he had to make beings who were autonomous.
It sounds like blaming the victim to me, though.
Yeah, I'm not going to evaluate it. I'm evaluated here. I have very mixed feelings about these arguments. As brilliant as I think some of them are, I find all of them ultimately flawed. But too complicated to go into here. But in any event, Garfield and Flanagan, so I'm going to kind of lump them together. I'll say a little bit about them separately, but they both think that Augustine invented free will to get God off the hook. And they say, therefore, there's no such creator God in Buddhism, so there's no need for any theodicy, and therefore there's no need for any free will. So it's a non-starter. In fact, there's no self in Buddhism, so that's another reason why it's a non-starter, because you don't have a self that could have free will. You don't have a need for free will, and so it's a waste of time. And that's why Garfield says, nothing left to lose. It's nothing to let go of by losing. We don't have to worry about losing free will in Buddhism. We don't have a need for it. We're better off without it. And Flanagan goes a step further and does this whole thing about, he analyzes a variety of different ways in which you might want to do some kind of cross-cultural or comparative philosophy. And I'm not going to summarize them, but one of them he calls cosmopolitan, another one I forget the various terms that he used, but he lays out all these grounds and for ways in which you might have a legitimate reason for trying to bring together two different traditions. And he said there's a liberal one and this one and that one, and he gives the pros and cons of each. And then he says the free will and Buddhism thing doesn't pass muster on any of those criteria. So he does a kind of argument by elimination. He kind of gives these adequacy conditions for what might justify bringing the two traditions together. And in the case of free will, he says it's not satisfied. That's another argument that he gives against. He says he thinks that free will is the black hole of Western philosophy, invented by Augustine. In fact, I remember when I gave that paper at the Columbia Conference on Ethics, the conference was mostly dedicated to critiquing his book that had just come out at the time, The Bodhisattva's Brain, Buddhism Naturalized, where he, in his own words, says that he describes his project as Buddhism without the hocus pocus. And a lot of the scholars there said that's Buddhism without Buddhism. But I remember he was the moderator on the panel that I presented on with a couple of other people. And in introducing us, he said it kind of disheartens him to find these four otherwise brilliant philosophers devoting so much thought and energy to this topic, which he thinks would be like the world's best physicists trying to work on cold fusion, which is a kind of, like phlogiston or some kind of in science. So it's kind of insulting. But Owen's also, he's kind of, I don't know, a little flamboyant and a little dramatic in his claims, but he's a really nice guy, and I've become very good friends with him as well. But so that's his argument, and I disagree with him. He recently said somewhere, I think on Facebook maybe, when commenting on my book, I think, or somewhere, he wrote, Rick and I disagreed about this, and Rick won. I think he was just being kind, though, because Owen's a very hardcore guy. It's very difficult to argue well against him. Um, let's see, Christian Kosaru. He co-presented on that panel with me also at Columbia. And Christian Kosaru and Jay Garfield and Evan Thompson, the three of them organized and directed an NEH seminar that I attended, I think in 2012 in Charleston, called Consciousness, Buddhist and Contemporary Philosophical Perspectives. It was a great, great experience. That's where I got to know a bunch of these Buddhist philosophers more closely. So anybody who's an academic doing this kind of work, I would highly recommend try to get into one of those NEH seminars. It's a really good way to connect. You spend 2 weeks with these people, arguing, debating, drinking wine, eating food, that. Christian, his title is Freedom from Responsibility, and the subtitle is Agent Neutral Consequentialism and the Bodhisattva Ideal. Now, Christian is a really complex thinker. I recently reviewed a book of his called Perceiving Reality. I forget the subtitle, but it was a book about Indian philosophy and mostly Buddhist philosophy, but he's really brilliant and knowledgeable about all of Indian philosophy. And he was advocating for a kind of phenomenological approach, which he thinks really sheds an awful. If you understand a lot of Indian philosophy as phenomenological in methodology, it kind of resolves an awful lot of problems. I tend to agree with him because meditation to me is a kind of phenomenological exercise. And Christian, I give him credit for this. He describes meditation as a kind of phenomenological bracketing when you just monitor your own mental states. It's kind of similar to phenomenological bracketing. Phenomenological bracketing in Western philosophy is you only look at what's given in experience you bracket off any projections or interpretations about what produced it or what the underlying reality is or what it means. Like what information is given in experience, period. So I think there's a really insightful parallel between Western continental phenomenology and Indian philosophy as phenomenology. So that's the book. That's where most of Christian's work has been on that. But in this chapter, I think it's hard for me I haven't really figured out how his main work informs this chapter. But in this chapter, well, maybe I think I just saw the connection right now, because in his book on phenomenology, he argues, I think, that given in experience is a subject, and it's undeniable. There's a perspectival aspect to all experience, right? You understand that, right? Like, everything, I'm at a certain vantage relative to my own perceptions, right? It's like I'm the narrative center of the universe of my experience.
Yeah, you're the middle of it. You can't know, and you can't know another person's experience, only your own.
Right. So, I think he's arguing. I think he hints in this chapter about how that to him makes for a real subject and therefore a real agent, and he thinks that the kind of moves that me and others like me in this book are making, they only can give you a kind of watered down agency that's not robust enough to ground moral responsibility. And so it's a kind of Kantian view about the self.
I was thinking I experience, therefore I am.
Yeah, something like that. And it's almost like a Kantian transcendental argument for the self based on subjectivity. And he thinks that moral-wise, in terms of traditional, at least Western moral philosophy, you need a real agent in order to be morally responsible. And so he's arguing that Buddhism falls short of that, and the kinds of compatibilist arguments that me and others like me make, they only give you a kind of watered-down moral responsibility that isn't quite strong enough to carry the load that moral responsibility normally requires. And, what critics will often say is that the only kind of responsibility that you could get on this kind of watered down model is something that you could get from what you call consequentialism or utilitarianism, or like B.F. Skinner, like we can control people, by holding people responsible, we can affect their behavior, we can imprison people, we can, penalty. So it's that. So it's not genuine moral responsibility. It's not genuine. So that's the kind of argument that he makes. And then he even applies that to the bodhisattva ideal, these titanic bodhisattvas who are willing to, kill people to prevent them from committing greater crimes and all sorts of things like that. He just shows that there are problems with that model, which I'm not so sure I could really summarize in a way better than what I just did now. Is just say that he thinks that Buddhism has a harder time handling moral responsibility than folks like me say that it does. Okay. Next one, Marie Frequignon. Her title is Free Will, Liberation, and Buddhist Philosophy. I think Marie, what she's doing here, she gave this paper at the Columbia Society for Comparative Philosophy years ago, and then rewrote it, revised it for this book to sharpen it and make it more scholarly. When she gives papers, she gives them very informally and casually. She's really good at that kind of speaking extemporaneously a lot and barely looking at the paper. She's one of the, I'm not good at that at all. When paper, like I'm doing this now, this is unusual for me. So I'm usually, I like to read papers, but that's not the best way. So she's really good at that. But so she rewrote the paper here, and I think what came out of it is she distinguishes between three kinds of freedom in the various branches of Buddhism: early Buddhism and later Buddhism, and liberation as a kind of freedom. And that's really all that she does, and points out some problems with them. I might have wanted to put that paper in the beginning of the book, but I forget why I arranged all of these articles in the sequence that I did, because there's a sense in which each one either sets the stage for or agrees or disagrees with the one before or after it in some way. So I think Marie does pick up on a little bit on what Christian Khosrow said about the fact that at the ultimate level, in Buddhism, there's no real agent or self, and so you can't really have genuine moral responsibility. She says something like that about the enlightened. She's a Mahayana. She's a big scholar of Santaraksita. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. Yeah, she acknowledges that there's this compatibilist view in the earlier forms of Buddhism, and I forget what the third view was, but she identifies three senses of freedom in Buddhism, and thinks that ultimately there's a problem with Buddhism and free will. Although I was just talking to her the other day about this, based on a paper that I'm going to be giving at there's a Fordham conference coming up at the end of the month here, and she agreed with me about this causal agency without the agent thing. So I was happy that I got her approval on that, based on her understanding of causality as the grounds for existence in Shantarakshita's writings. That's the guy she specializes in. All right, B. Alan Wallace, next chapter, chapter 10, Buddhism and Free Will. Beyond the Free Will Problem is the title. This is a reprinted paper. Alan rewrote this paper also significantly to shorten it for this book. And I think he's talking about kind of like what you and I were talking about, or I would say more even you, when you were saying, I live at a level that's not atomistic. I'm a whole person and I bang my head on the table and it hurts and stuff like that. And so Alan, he says, he thinks that if determinism is true, then there can't be free will. But then he is a Mahayana Buddhist. He's a big writer and former translator for the Dalai Lama and whatnot, Tibetan teacher. And he's got a whole Institute of Consciousness Studies out in Santa Barbara. This article is all about the pragmatics of free will. So he says, although he doesn't think Buddhism is deterministic. If it was deterministic, there couldn't be free will, but he rejects the determinism-indeterminism dichotomy on the grounds of later Mahayana anti-realist metaphysics. So he says, and that makes sense. And then he also thinks that he makes a big case for the same kinds of agency that I talk about that are increased through meditation practice. And in some of his other writings, he's even said things like, I forget what the name of that book was. The Attention Revolution was one of the books. In that book, I remember him saying to the beginner meditation practitioner, he's trying to kind of get them to realize a certain point. He says, take a moment right now to try to focus your mind on just one thing. Close your eyes and hold it there, and then come back when you're done. And he says something like, I bet only a few seconds went by. If you can't control your thought and your attention for a few seconds, what kind of free will do you have? And
but that's like saying if you can't pick up this 300-pound weight without any practice whatsoever, then you have no strength. I'm like, well, yes, but over time we can practice and change.
Exactly. So start with 5-pound weights. And that's exactly what he says. He says Buddhism is not concerned with the metaphysics of determinism and indeterminism and all that kind of stuff, even though Buddhism talks about that stuff. The goal is to get you enlightened. And so what you need to do is develop practical free will, which is to increase the range and ability of, your control over your own emotions and volitions and thoughts and whatnot, where your attention goes and all that. And then he talks about how all that works together with meditation and how you can increase your free will.
Rick, you've introduced me to the unique experience of whole agreement with Alan Wallace. I've never had that before. Thank you.
Oh, good. So then you should read that. If you don't get your hands on the book, what do you call it? That you can find his earlier chapter on that, or I could send you a PDF of that as well if you want. Because he had published that other chapter online. I think you can get the PDF for free online of the earlier version of that article. Okay, so that's Alan. Let's see. Oh, Martin T. Adam is the next one. Degrees of Freedom, subtitle, The Buddha's Implied Views on the Impossibility of Free Will. So Martin Adam has a view very much like my own, I think. He says that very much like Wallace, there's a lot of stuff that we could do that will lighten our load as agents, in terms of these abilities and whatnot. But then he goes to the Lakkhana, I forget the full name of it, Sutta, where there's the arguments about the no self, that the self is, I think the arguments are, I can't control any of the aggregates, like volition, perception. He mentions that the different aggregates that allegedly constitute us, right? And this is the Buddha. And the argument goes something like, if that was myself, then I could will it to be otherwise. I could will suffering not to occur in that aggregate, but I can't do that. And so that is not the self. And it's a kind of argument by elimination. All the different things that make us up are not the self, so there's no self. And so he kind of repeats that argument, and he says, so from the enlightened point of view, there is no self, but there is a kind of compatibilist agency that we have that can be increased on the path, and that's what the path is all about. So that's an interesting view. It's very similar to my own. In fact, he quotes Harry Frankfurt, who I mentioned earlier, who I said was on my dissertation committee, and he's an icon in the Western literature on free will. Harry Frankfurt had an interesting view that I would be happy to plug just for a moment here. Frankfurt said, look, when we were talking about being able to do what you want to do earlier, as what young children think of as free will, Frankfurt says, animals, young children, and even people who are kind of insane or mental pathologies, they all have that ability. A horse wants to run to the left, and it does. And that's freedom of action, he says, which is simply the ability to act on your desires. Now, if you're chained or in a prison cell or, on a drug or, you become paralyzed, you don't have freedom of action. But freedom of action is not really essential to freedom of will. Because first of all, we don't hold animals and young children and people pathologically deranged morally responsible. So we're going to use moral responsibility as a criterion to figure out what matters. Is it freedom of action? No, it's freedom of will. What is freedom of will? Being able to have the kind of will that you want. And that's kind of abstract, but how he breaks it down is we have desires, let's say to run to the left or to eat peanut butter or whatever it is, and then we also have what he calls higher order desires, or I'll just call them meta desires or meta volitions, which is I either approve or disapprove of those base or first order or lower order desires. So if I have desires to not do something, I have desires to do it, and then I have a higher order disapproval of it. Like, oh, gee, I had this random desire, and I disapprove of it. I don't want to act on it, but then I do act on it. I have weakness of will. But, we can't control the desires that biology and nature and experience generate in us, but we have an ability to approve or disapprove of them and identify or disidentify with them. And those are higher order desires. And freedom of the will is being able to have the kind of will that you want to have, which is both lower and higher order desires, A and B, to have a kind of harmony between them. So I've done this in an earlier article that I wrote for the journal Buddhist Ethics in 2010. And right around the same time, Martin Adam wrote his earlier version of this article. This was really only a small part of it is the same as that earlier article, but it was revised based on that. So he makes a big deal out of Frankfurt's distinction between freedom of action, freedom of the will, and then he says freedom of the self, which I don't think that Frankfurt really talked about that. I think that Adam is kind of interpreting Frankfurt in a way that I disagree with. But ultimately, there's a view called semi-compatibilism that I think Adam and a lot of other philosophers, myself included, are probably really advocating, and it might be worth it to talk about that for a minute. So compatibilists are like soft determinists who think, oh, if determinism is true, you could still have free will, even though you couldn't have done otherwise. And Frankfurt is the author, one of the first authors of a really good argument for compatibilism. So in 1969, he wrote this paper called Alternate Possibilities and Moral Responsibility in the Journal of Philosophy. And the argument goes something like this. It's a brilliant counterexample. He says, well, consider this principle, the principle of alternate possibilities. And this, he thinks, is essentially associated with free will by most people who think of free will in the strong sense that we talked about, things being up to us and being able to do otherwise. And the principle goes like this, quote, an agent is responsible for doing X if in doing X the agent could have done otherwise, end of quote. And that might not be the exact quote, but that's the idea. And we talked about that earlier. So Frankfurt says, I disagree with that. And why that matters is, of course, if determinism is true, an agent could never do otherwise. And so nobody would ever have free will if that principle was true. And they could never be morally responsible. And that's also the idea that I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, that free will and moral responsibility are inseparable. And we could use moral responsibility to figure out what free will is and vice versa. So this principle, the principle of alternate possibilities, presupposes that intimate link between those two notions, being able to do otherwise and being morally responsible for what you do. Frankfurt says no. And his counterexample is pretty brilliant, and it spurned a whole cottage industry of counterexamples just like it that are all called Frankfurt cases, named to him. And hundreds of articles have been written about it. It's still being argued. But the example goes something like this. Imagine Jones is some unwitting victim of Dr. Black, a mad neuroscientist, who implanted a chip in Jones's brain unbeknownst to Jones. And Black wants Jones to vote Democratic. It doesn't matter. It could have been Republican. It doesn't, either way. And he's going to monitor, this is with future neuroscience and computing, so he can monitor Jones's neural states, which the computer interprets for him as mental states. And he can tell if Jones is even about to consider voting for someone other than a Democrat. And if Jones indicates through his neural processes in any way that he's about to vote for something other than a Democrat, Dr. Black will press a button which will interfere with Jones's neurons and block that alternative from him. So Dr. Black has the ability and intends to block Jones from having that alternative open to him. So in effect, hypothetically, in this thought experiment, Jones cannot vote for anything other than a Democrat. Now, when Jones goes into the booth, Black is monitoring his neural states, but sees no signs whatsoever that Jones is deviating from the desired path. And Jones votes for the Democrat of his own accord. Dr. Black doesn't have to press any buttons, and it's as if there's no chip in his brain because he didn't have to use it. So Frankfurt says, in this case, Jones had no alternative. He was unable to do otherwise, but surely he's responsible for his vote because he did it of his own accord. He voted for his own reasons. He was not manipulated or influenced, and therefore the principle of alternate possibilities is false. And that's pretty kind of subtle and tricky. And
well, it's just a different form of chain. It's really the will is about that determination. Not being able to execute them is a separate matter. It's related, but it's a separate matter.
Right. So the thing is, if Jones had tried to vote otherwise, he would not have been able to. But the argument that Frankfurt is making is, it doesn't matter, because even if Jones could have voted otherwise, if he had wanted to, he didn't. He chose freely to vote as he did. And that's what matters for moral responsibility. So it's kind of on to something. Of course, philosophers have been arguing with him ever since about whether or not that example carries the weight that it's supposed to. But Martin T. Adam likes that argument, and he thinks that we have some kind of compatibilist, agency, but ultimately there's no real self. So he has a kind of two-level view. And there's a group of philosophers called semi-compatibilists, started by a philosopher named John Martin Fisher, who in fact happens to be the first person who endorsed my book. You open it up right inside the flap. John Martin Fisher is the founder of semi-compatibilism, and he makes this argument. In a deterministic world, we saw this argument before, you have the consequence argument. Your choice is just an inevitable consequence of causal conditions that are lawfully in place prior to your existence, and it's a mere consequence of those. They're inalterable, and so you have no real free will in the strong sense of it being up to you, which he thinks means and requires you could have done otherwise. So you don't have strong free will. That's impossible in a deterministic world. Maybe in an indeterministic world, you could, but that's a separate question that you could care less about. The point is, in a deterministic world, you can't do otherwise, so you lack strong free will, which by definition means you could have done otherwise. On the other hand, however, because Frankfurt is right, John Martin Fisher says, you can still have moral responsibility. You're still responsible for what you did if you did it voluntarily, and then Fisher adds a bunch of other criteria that are similar to the kind of criteria that I use. He says things like, if you're reason responsive, that means if you are functional as a deliberative agent, you can recognize morally relevant reasons and facts, you can deliberate upon them appropriately, and you can choose appropriate responses to them in accordance with your values and all that, then you are functional as an agent. Even though your behavior is determined and you don't have strong free will, you still are capable of being held morally responsible in the way Frankfurt thought that voter Jones was. So we call this semi-compatibilism. You don't have full, real, metaphysically robust autonomy, but you have enough kind of proximal self-control to ground either a weak form of free will, or at least it seems morally appropriate to hold you morally responsible for what you've done. And the issue of moral responsibility, I think Charles Goodman makes a good point about this. I don't remember if he did it in this chapter or just in discussions, arguments with me, but the issue about hard determinism is not metaphysics. He says it's just, if determinism is true, he thinks it's a moral issue whether or not it makes sense to hold you responsible if the agency is just an inevitable consequence of ancient causal conditions. He thinks that's a moral question, not a metaphysical one, and he thinks that the answer is no. See what I mean? That's a moral issue. What are the moral grounds, what are the adequacy conditions on moral responsibility? And from Charles's point of view, he's, I think, mostly a Mahayana-oriented Buddhist scholar. He thinks nobody deserves anything because it's all ultimately impersonal. So that's also the basis for his view. All right. So let's see. Who else do I have to say something about here? I'm going to find my table of contents again. I'll close the book for a moment. Oh, yeah, Mark Sideritz. Okay, Mark is, I think 1987, Mark wrote the first article, well, not the first, one of the first really good articles about Buddhism and free will. There were a few other people before him in the 60s and 70s, only a handful. But Mark has a view called paleo-compatibilism. Paleo, I guess, has to do just with ancient times, and I forget where he got the phrase from something else. He explains it in an earlier version of the paper. But what by paleo-compatibilism, he just means is a particular early Buddhist way of thinking that revolves around the two truths. So we said we might want to talk about them again, that can ground a certain kind of compatibilism. So Mark he's written a number of papers about this since 1987, at least a half a dozen of them. And in fact, this one is a rewrite of one of those papers. And these rewrites all say what the original paper was, of course, in the footnotes. But this view goes something like this. Determinism is a kind of ultimate reality level doctrine in Abhidharma, early Buddhist metaphysics, right? So psychophysical atomistic tropes, like mind moments, dharmas, or whatever you want to call them, those are the ultimately real things. And determinism as a Buddhist doctrine is about them, about the causal nature of those, and how volitions and sensations and perceptions, all the things that happen to us at this highly macro level of the aggregations of our experience, they all reduce down, right? So this Abhidharma is reductionism. All of our mental states and, table level and person level stuff reduces ultimately to these atomistic tropes. That's where determinism is. Determinism is an ultimate reality level doctrine. And free will is a macro level, therefore conventional level doctrine. So tables and persons and human bodies and choices and states of mind, all those are wholes. They're macro level objects and things. And those are conventional things. So he says, technically, there can't be any incompatibility between the two things, between you being a real agent, like you said, you operate at the level of being a person who could bang your head against a table, and you make choices that determine your experiences and all that. All of that is macro level, it's conventional level, and it's got a conventional reality. It's ultimately false, but we live on a conventional level. And so we have a kind of libertarian free will, not just a compatibilist or soft or weak sense of free will. We have real free will at the level of conventionality, conventional existence, and it makes sense for us to hold each other responsible because of that and so on. He says, but all of that reduces, at least much of it does reduce. I guess what doesn't reduce would be more illusory than what does reduce. So part of the table reduces to all of its parts. The whole of it doesn't, but the rest of it does, all of its parts, right? So that kind of thing. So it's a very subtle argument about person series. There are parts of persons that supervene on and therefore reduce to things as person series that are ultimately, micro constituents that are very ephemeral, but from Abhidharma reductionism, they're real. So he calls this paleo-compatibilism. There can't be an incompatibility between the two levels of discourse because he thinks that they're semantically insulated. They're two different languages. They're two different ways of talking about reality that they don't really translate to each other. Nothing at the whole level, really. You can't, like the whole is like a table. The table is bigger than any of its parts, and so it can't be identical to any of its parts. That kind of thing. So it's a very complicated argument. I've criticized it, even though I think he's generally on to something. I'm not 100% confident about every detail of his argument. Number one, I'm not so sure about the semantic. I think a lot of his argument hinges on his claim that the two discourses are semantically insulated from each other. I mean, the Buddha shifted back and forth between ultimate and conventional level discourse all the time, and then scientists do it all the time, and we all tend to do it all the time, and we're increasingly doing that the more enlightened we become because of science. So I'm not so sure about semantic insulation, and I think that is at the core of his argument that free will and determinism are compatible, because free will is conventional level reality and determinism is ultimate level reality. So that's, I guess, about all I'll say about Mark. Ben Abelson, next chapter, is called Shifting Coalitions, Free Will, and the Responsibility of Persons. Ben just got his PhD at the CUNY Grad Center, and I heard him give this paper at an American Philosophical Association national, one of those annual conventions, maybe a year or two earlier than this paper was written for the book. He rewrote that for the book. And I thought it was a great paper, and I asked him to contribute it to the book. I had already had all of my other contributors lined up, but after I heard Ben's paper, I thought it was really good, and I wanted him to put it in here. I think it turns out to be this is the first publication Ben ever had, so he's really excited and happy about it. Ben is a great guy from the CUNY Grad Center, too, so we have that in common, but I was there years before him. In any event, what he does here is he talks about how Mark Sideritz, the same guy in the previous chapter, has an attempt to address that problem that you brought up about the self and free will and moral responsibility. If there's no self, Mark Sideritz says, well, there doesn't have to be a self. You could have something functionally equivalent to a self and Mark has reasons why there can't be a self. It's kind of like that thing like the knife can't cut itself. It's an anti-reflexivity principle. So to get around that, and there are arguments like that are very subtle, and that's a whole vast body of literature about whether or not consciousness is reflexive in the way that a knife can't cut itself. Can consciousness be aware of itself? So to get around that problem, which is more about the metaphysics of self and consciousness, Marx suggests a model that he calls a shifting coalitions model. And according to that model, I can, in a Frankfurt kind of way, be aware of my lower order intentions, my higher order approvals of them. I can reflect on my perceptions and sensations and desires and experiences and all of that. And what constitutes my reflection at a particular moment is a particular coalition or an aggregation of all of those elements of my consciousness at that moment. Now, I can't be aware of all of those things in a way that's independent of them. But at one time or another, a different part of me can be aware of all the rest of them. And this, according to Buddhism, is always a process, like a running stream. And so long as some part of me can be aware of all the other parts of me at a different time, and that is shifting, which part of me, like this moment of awareness, right? And in each moment of awareness, there are different objects of awareness. As long as there's a shifting coalition, which is causally clustered closely enough with continuity and threads that, one feeds into the next, it's enough to make for a substantial person series without there being a real self. And there's enough agency and personhood without a real person in that shifting coalition to ground a sense of moral responsibility. And one of the critiques of that model was from Galen Strawson, who said that in his own critique of a real self in another work, Galen said that you can't really account for, on a shifting coalitions model, you can't really account for our fear of our own future suffering, our flossing our teeth, things like that. There's a variety of things that, investment in our retirement, things that we can't really account for on a shifting coalitions model because it's not really the self. And so Ben Abelson tries to kind of cut in between both Galen Strawson's criticism of the shifting coalitions model and Strawson's model itself, and Sideritz's model. And Ben kind of defends Sideritz's model, and he says, but it gets you a kind of moral responsibility But it's kind of like that fellow earlier, Christian Kosaru, who said it's not enough moral responsibility. It's like moral responsibility light, like Skinner kind of moral responsibility. So Abelson says it's not that weak, but it's not strong enough to satisfy Christian Kosaru, without naming him. But he's, this is pretty much, this is a very subtle, complex set of, high level arguments that Ben is juggling in that article. I guess those would only really matter to somebody who's already deeply trying to work out the issue of self. Is there enough self for there to be, like Goodman said, Charles Goodman, no, there can't be moral responsibility without a real self, right? There can't be desert if there's no real self. All right, so that's what Abelson tries to do. It's not as bad as Strawson says, but it's not as good as Sidderitz thinks. It's a kind of middle path in between. Peter Harvey, next article, is called Psychological versus Metaphysical Agents, and the subtitle is a Theravada Buddhist view of free will and moral responsibility. Peter Harvey has written a lot about this in other places, in books and in articles. There's one of the earliest ones was an article, I think it was in the Journal of Buddhist Ethics, I think the year 2007. Harvey admits at the very end of the article, which might be smart to start there, that he's a semi-compatibilist. And I think he's the only Buddhist scholar that I know of who's used that term. And I think I influenced him to do that. I read what these people write, and they read what I write about them and everything, before I ever send anything out. So I've had a lot of email communications with Peter Harvey. He's very friendly and helpful as a scholar. But yeah, he's mostly restricted to Theravada. He knows a lot about the other traditions, but I think he is a Theravada Buddhist. So he takes a very straightforward kind of compatibilist view. It used to be a more simplistic or kind of naive compatibilism, as I used to criticize the earlier Buddhists. Just because we have the ability to make choices and act on volitions, that's kind of like freedom of action. For the average person on the street and 4-year-old kids, that's free will, but it's a much more complicated thing than that. And so I think that the more he's become familiar with the problems for his earlier view, the more sophisticated it's become. I mean, it's a brilliant view. I don't mean to give the impression that his view was kind of uncultivated, because it's really rich, that earlier article that he wrote about it. In that article, the earlier one, this is completely written new for this book. In the earlier one, he talks a lot about those kinds of abilities that I myself argue are the things that make agency seem quite real from a functional perspective. Now, there's a fellow whose name, I forget his first name, but Aronson is the last name, who I quote in my material, who makes a good case that reminds me of Peter Harvey's view, which is that psychological free will or psychological personhood is different from metaphysical or ontological free will or personhood. So when we talk about whether or not there is a self, there's a kind of ambiguity there. And I think you and I have touched upon it, where in the world of our experience, we function as if we have a self. And according to all those abilities that I say are associated with agency, if you study them the right way, using a kind of causal analysis, like when this is present, that happens and all that, you'll see that we have agency. The average person has a lot less of it, and the Buddhist practitioner, I think, has a lot more of it, and that's what increases. But what Aronson said, and I agree with him, is that the more you travel the Buddhist path, the more your psychological freedom, psychological personhood or agency increases. Simultaneous with that, the less real the self even seems to you. So the metaphysical self, as an ontologically independent thing like a soul, that model becomes less and less experientially real for you, even while your experiential agency increases. And so Harvey pretty much says the same thing in that article. And please stop me at any point if I'm just going too abstract.
We've only got 2 more to go, Emily and Karen.
So, yeah, Emily McRae is a Tibetan Buddhist scholar, and she's focusing on Tsongkhapa, who's like a patriarch of Tibetan Buddhism. And the argument that she makes there is similar to mine and Harvey's and a lot of others, even though it's focused entirely on this one guy, Tsongkhapa, because Tsongkhapa gave this training manual about how to control and regulate emotions. And Emily McRae, I think she did her dissertation on emotions from the point of Western philosophical work. Emotions, all the way back from Plato in the Western, canon, are seen as irrational, the non-really person part of us. Reason is what's distinctive of humans, and emotions is more distinctive of animals. And that kind of view is still informing a lot of Western philosophy of mind. But Emily, going through Tsongkhapa's training, uncovers all these different ways in which Tsongkhapa, from his own meditation experience and as a Buddhist scholar and commentator on previous, Buddhist philosophy, has identified all the ways in which we can capture, identify, see the signs of, and really completely learn the etiology of emotions and see the conditions that trigger them and learn all of these different ways of regulating parts of us that are normally not under our control. And so she's making an argument very much like mine in terms of the abilities that we can cultivate on the Buddhist path give us a tremendous agency, much greater than the agency that the average person has. But ultimately, there's no real self. So she's moving in the same direction. And then Karen Myers is also, but she's going at it from the point of view of her scholarship. She's a Vasubandhu scholar, so that's an early Abhidharma philosopher, and kind of crossover between the Abhidharma and then the later Mahayana philosophers. Vasubandhu kind of in the middle there. She wrote her dissertation on Vasubandhu and free will. So I'm happy to see that there's this work going on now. There wasn't that much when I started doing my research on this, and that is a lot. So
does it seem like more and more is happening that people are interested in this exploration of free will and self and all of that within a Buddhist context?
Yeah, I think so. I think that I didn't give the year, but I finished my dissertation in 2005. And at the time, there were only a handful of things written about Buddhism and free will. I wrote an article reviewing them for the Journal of Buddhist Ethics called Earlier Buddhist Theories of Free Will. Actually, it was a series of articles that I wrote. There were 4 of them in the Journal of Buddhist Ethics. One was earlier theories, and then 2 of them were what I called middle period theories. One was just about Mark Sideritz, and the other one was about Charles Goodman. And then I wrote another article called Recent Theories. They all have subtitles, but I pretty much wrote about all the extant literature on Buddhism and free will in those 4 articles that all appear in the Journal of Buddhist Ethics, which is a free online journal, by the way. So folks might go, you can get all that stuff there and just search for Repetti in there. But yeah, since then, an awful lot has come out. I mean, all these different people who contributed to this book, and there were a number of other people who wanted to, who were about to, who said they would, but who had to back out because they were too busy, or said from the beginning, I'd love to, but I'm too busy. So there's a number of these things. If you look at the bibliographies in these articles, there's a kind of mushrooming interest in agency from a Buddhist perspective, not so much necessarily free will, but there's a lot of research about like all the different problems that I've mentioned in this conversation about like reflexivity and the self. You see, like there are aspects of this popping up all over the place in Evan Thompson's work in a variety of places. Jake Davis, I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yep, no, Jake.
Yeah, he's done a lot of work on emotion and mindfulness, and a lot of Buddhists are reluctant to come out and talk about free will because of folks like Jay Garfield and Owen Flanagan and others who say that's kind of like a non-starter. It's oxymoronic. It's like kosher ham. Buddhist free will. That can't be.
You are on a secular Buddhist podcast, so we're okay with that dichotomy.
Right. So, but I think that's the reason why a lot of, even though there's a lot of stuff on the subject, a lot of it is not explicit with free will in the title and stuff like that. but there's a lot of relevant stuff. Yeah, I think the subject has really mushroomed. A woman contacted me. She's writing her dissertation at Oxford right now. Just last week, she sent me an email saying, "Oh, I just got your book. I'm reading it. I'm doing my dissertation on Buddhism and free will at Oxford. I'm studying under Jan Westerhoff, and she wants to review the book." And I was like, "Wow, that's great." And I get a lot of people contacting me. I've had a lot of feedback, so I'm happy about all the interest. It's an interesting issue. Look, the interest in meditation is a kind of popular thing that goes far beyond the walls of academic philosophy in the West. And there's all these arguments that I know you're familiar with because we've shared comments about them online about, the uses and abuses of mindfulness and meditation and all of that in popular culture and stuff. But there's all of that, and then so there's interest. I think the philosophical dimension of it is filtering out into the general population. There's a lot more stuff going on in philosophy, trying to reach out to the general public and make philosophy palatable and understandable to the ordinary person, make philosophy relevant to live lives and stuff like that. And I think that interest in free will and Buddhism is kind of related to that, because a lot of people who are interested in Buddhism, the philosophy attracts them. They're curious. But I think we're all automatically given to believing in free will. Like you said, I'm a person, it's a table. I think I have free will. So then the question arises naturally, well, Buddhists don't think there's a self. Does that mean I don't have free will? What should I think about?
Who's this I?
So it's a puzzle that I think is naturally, because of the popularity of Buddhism in Western thought, I think it's only natural that puzzle should appear more often, and more philosophers and scholars are addressing it. Yeah, so one of the last things I'll say about Karen Myers is that she makes an argument almost the same as my own. She goes a step further, I think, by identifying, like, in the Buddhist literature, the degree of self-control that advanced Buddhist practitioners alleged to exert is phenomenal and supernormal, if not paranormal. Buddhist masters exert tremendous self-control, which is a kind of autonomy in the absence of a self. So I think her arguments are interesting. I would say she's, like a number of the other people in the book, some kind of two-tiered semi-compatibilist. And that's I think I've gone through all of them, yeah.
So for folks who are interested in finding out more, we have links to the book itself, which is on the episode page for this episode, Buddhist Perspectives on Free Will, Agentless Agency with a question mark. Our guest today, Rick Repetti. Rick, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure. It really went quite a bit longer than I thought it would. I didn't notice the time. See, when you're having fun.
Philosophy always does.
Great. Well, thanks again, Ted. It was a great pleasure and an honor.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.